5:30. This program is supported by MyLabs, patient-ordered testing. San Juan Regional Medical Center is expanding its services to offer low-cost blood screenings year-round. Now offering walk-in convenience to get the blood tests you want when you want them. MyLabs, patient-ordered testing, is available at the hospital's laboratory and the Outpatient Diagnostic Center on 30th Street in Farmington. With nearly 20 tests available, there's an option for everyone. MyLabs, patient-ordered testing, a wellness service of San Juan Regional Medical Center. (8:34) on KSJE. You're listening to the Scott Michlin Morning Program. Welcome to our viewers who are watching us live this morning on Facebook and YouTube, part of our visual radio studio performance here at San Juan College. Showing you the weather forecast right now for the next 10 days, and it looks like a partly sunny day today. Some clouds in the forecast and a chance of showers and thunderstorms. 70 for a high in Farmington, 46 and clearing overnight. Mostly sunny skies for Friday, 67 for a high tomorrow. Partly sunny on Saturday, 68, and maybe another chance of rain and much cooler weather on Sunday with a high of only 56, and more chances for showers early next week with highs again in the mid-50s. I'm Scott Michlin. My guest on the radio this morning from Archaeology Southwest and Salmon Ruins, Paul Reed, is here in the studio. Good morning once again.
Good morning, Scott.
Thanks for being here in person.
Glad to be here.
We appreciate you wherever we can catch up with you. Some days it's at home, some days it's on the road, some days it's here.
That's right. I love your new studio. This is a great setup.
Thank you very much. We're very proud of it. And again, it's because of the support we get from the community. KSJE, as a reminder, everyone, is a listener-supported radio station, so we couldn't do what we do without the support of many local residents and businesses and, of course, San Juan College. So it's great to be able to share it with the community, which is what we like to do. So good to have you here.
Indeed.
We were talking about bog bodies in the first part of the program and some interesting archaeological discoveries in Ireland and that area of the world. Another thing I wanted to ask you about is this use of LIDAR, which is this type of radar, I guess, or similar concept of radar, but it's LIDAR. So the acronym is a little different.
Right.
And they're using that in some of the parts of the world. South America comes to mind, and Central America, to really kind of get underneath the tree canopies to see the landscape, and they're uncovering a lot of previously maybe undiscovered stuff.
Right. I think I don't think it's an overestimation to say that this is revolutionizing discovery of archaeological sites and historic sites worldwide. So LIDAR is laser scanning from basically low altitude planes. So we're talking 1,000 feet, even lower in some cases. The planes fly over. They're using lasers basically to capture imagery of the ground. So there's photographs, there's laser imagery. And what makes the LIDAR particularly interesting is you collect all those data and you literally end up with billions of points that are collected, depending upon how the instruments are set. Then you bring those back, and there's pretty intensive processing with computers. But what you can do with the LIDAR ultimately is you can strip away all the vegetation. So if you are in Central America, you're looking for Mayan remains or Toltec sites, etc., you can basically take the jungle away as you process. And that's what they used down in the Mayan country and found an amazing set of sites in showing one particular spot. Yeah, I'm showing a bit of a story from National Geographic on our screen at the moment for folks who are watching, and you can kind of see the two different images of the forest in apparently Guatemala, modern-day Guatemala, and then when you take away that tree canopy and the trees, kind of what that LIDAR is showing underneath that and the sites that you can see above the trees, but there's much, much more. Right, and this, LIDAR allows large areas to be scanned, photographed, assessed with relatively low expense. I mean, it's not cheap. I think we can do it here in the Southwest for about $1 an acre is what I've heard. Okay. So if you wanted to fly a large area, you'd be looking at several $100,000 potentially, and we can talk about a study that was done on that in a minute. But compared to boots on the ground archaeology? Exactly. Compared to walking it and going through all that, and, in the desert we see things. If it's there, we're going to see it. The LIDAR helps us find things that are subtle. In the jungles of Central America and other places worldwide, you're not even going to know where to begin looking. Right. And you might just want to survey a particular block of land, and that's what archaeologists do. If we have known Mayan sites or others, then archaeologists will design a survey program to go out and do what's called a pedestrian survey, and you literally walk through the jungle. But, your friend there is a giant machete because you're going to have to cut your way through. What the LIDAR allows is an assessment of much larger areas in a much more rapid fashion, and then people can go in and say, hey, there's a bunch of interesting, cool things here. Maybe there's some temples and pyramids, maybe there's just some residential sites. So then you dispatch the crews, and you still have to cut away the jungle, but at least you know where to go and to do it. So again, it's a revolutionary tool for finding things.
And it's only been around for, the last few years, right?
Yeah, the LIDAR technology is no more than a decade old.
Yeah.
And it allows us to do this. We can also do super fine LIDAR work up close. So if we have like a rock panel with different images, petroglyphs, pictographs, we can go in with a machine that'll scan that and produce extremely high resolution photographs and maps that way. So you can both do the focused work that way and then the aerial coverage. And, it's amazing technology.
Right. And so in our area, of course, because we don't have a lot of trees and tree canopies, and especially not out in the open desert where a lot of these sites are located, it's not quite as advantageous, I guess, to use it here, but can it still show some things that have been buried for eons?
Right. It can, and it's, but it doesn't get to the buried stuff. So that's a different remote sensing technique that I think we've talked about. We've talked about magnetometer, which actually gives you a hint of what's going on beneath the ground penetrating radar. The LIDAR actually works with the surface. But what it does do is it picks up very subtle surface features that if, let's say, you're walking out north of Chaco, for example, on the Greater Chaco landscape, you're looking for potential road features. We know that the Great North Road comes out of Chaco, and there's 3 or 4 segments at different points that are parallel, and then that comes down to a single segment. And that's been pretty well documented. But let's say we're looking at an outlier site that's off the North Road a ways, and we suspect there's roads, maybe a road that connects it back to Chaco or back to another site on the North Road. You could walk those areas physically with a pedestrian survey. You might not see anything. If you do the LIDAR study, you might see more subtle features that are not there, which would then give you data to go out in the field. And in fact, there was just such a study done as part of the work that BLM is doing to modify their management plan for this area, which we've talked about. And this is the Farmington BLM.
Right.
They commissioned LIDAR over a large span of an area surrounding Chaco Canyon and then going up the North Road and then certain areas up here in Farmington, Aztec, Bloomfield that hadn't been covered through prior work. So we really have a nice body of data now, and we've started to look at that with some folks who are specialists at basically teasing out features on the landscape, again, in the lab, and saying, hey, this looks like this might be a potential road. So when we get those data, then we can go out in the field and say, oh, okay, this is a 2-track road, or it's a road that's accessing this modern house or this historic house, or it's an old pipeline, linear scar from a 1950s pipeline. We see those.
Right.
But once you get away from, you sort of screen out the modern effects, then you can get back to things that are older. We found wagon roads this way, and Chacoan roads are detectable this way.
Interesting.
So, yeah, it's really a very useful tool. The processing time can be high, like I said, and then people have to actually do some work, comparing aerial images and the LIDAR. We can also use heat data. This is something that NASA gathers routinely, and I have a colleague who's tapped into that and is helping us assess that. So we have these different methods of basically seeing what the ground looks like today and what it might have looked like in the past.
Sure. And for someone like me who has no archaeological experience except talking to you every month, so I must have some degree somewhere,
You
right?
do now.
Some credits will transfer over. But it's really fascinating to me to see pictures of these things, these techniques, or these landscapes that apparently are roads or evidence of roads, and it really is hard for me to see them, but apparently not so much for people like you to see them.
Right.
But it's a real subtle difference.
There are subtle differences. In the Chaco roads, the ones that had the most energy input and were the most well constructed are fairly obvious once you know what to look for, because they appear as swales. So they're areas that were actually excavated in some ways. Dirt was cleared, and then you've got a roadway, and a lot of times rocks were lined up for curbing. So some of them are very obvious, but then there are points on the landscape.
I guess I haven't seen those pictures, but
No.
I've seen the other ones.
Over time, the landscape erodes, you lose some of these things, you get into badlands, and they disappear completely. And we do have different areas like that out in the basin. And in other areas, you see them perfectly in air photos. You can confirm them with LIDAR, and you go out and you go, wow,
Right.
this is really subtle, and I'm not really seeing this. But the aerial imagery tells us that that was a road, in fact. So, so that's why we have that level of technology to assist us in seeing things that we may not see real clearly on the ground.
Sure. So in New Mexico, maybe not so much of a place for this LIDAR technology, but I would think maybe in Colorado, maybe some of the mesa tops and things like that, even though there's not a lot of trees, there is still ground cover. Is that a different story?
Yeah, it's been used effectively, and not just in archaeological studies. People use it for wildlife management because you can detect game trails. You can detect changes in patterns of vegetation. Because I spoke about, in the Mayan jungles about making the vegetation go away. But if you're interested in the vegetation,
right,
the LIDAR lets you highlight different aspects of that, and you can really see the difference in patterning between grasslands, sagebrush, scrublands, and then making the transition to actual forest. So, yeah, it's a useful tool really across the West in a lot of different studies in the environmental and cultural fields.
Interesting. Paul Reed is my guest this morning. He works with Archaeology Southwest and Salmon Ruins, and we're talking a little bit about some of the activities going on in this part of the world. And Paul, we only have about maybe 5 minutes left or so this morning, and I know you've been doing a lot of work on the Greater Chaco area. You've been working with some of the Pueblo governors and tribal areas that have interest in the Greater Chaco area. Can you give us an update on
sure
what your conversations have been like with them and what's happening?
Yeah, one of the things that is happening is our senators Heinrich and Udall have introduced a bill to withdraw some acreage around Chaco Canyon. We've talked, and our partners and allies have talked for a few years about trying to protect Chaco. So we have Chaco Culture National Historic Park, and then we have areas around it that have different oil and gas and other mineral resources. And we've talked about having some of those lands removed from additional oil and gas exploration at this point. I think as we've talked on the show before, this area is about 91% leased. So, and this goes from Chaco area south quite a distance all the way up to here in Farmington. And there's a lot of different points of access already on the landscape for the oil and gas resources. So we're talking about putting some additional protections in place. So there's a bill that was introduced in the Senate, and Pueblo leaders went out this past week from the Pueblos of Acoma. I think we had Zuni and some Hopi leaders all go to Washington, D.C. to basically lobby for greater protections. And, of course, for Pueblo people, Greater Chaco is their ancestral landscape. Mm-hmm. And, of course, then we have lots of Navajo folks in the area, and the Navajo Nation as well is interested in putting some protection on this land. So that's one of the directions we're heading. We're also working with the Pueblo of Acoma to go out later this month and look at some specific areas on the land that might have basically clues to Acoma's origin stories, to their oral history, and connections to Chaco Canyon. So, and that's an ethnographic study that we're particularly interested in and pretty excited about.
Interesting. And with that being said, how many acres are we talking about that would be up for more protection?
We're looking at a pretty small amount of acreage in the overall. I think the Farmington Field Office manages something like 7.8 million acres. So we're looking at about 300,000, just over that, for areas where the federal minerals would be withdrawn from future leasing. And that would still allow the access points that are already on the landscape in terms of well pads and et cetera.
Right.
But this begins a process of protecting some of these areas and really sort of looking ahead to 20 years, 30 years when, this oil field has passed through the period that's going to pass through, and how does this landscape look in the post-oil and gas, era for the Greater Chaco area? Because, we're not going to be doing oil and gas forever out there. These are finite resources. So, and the oil and gas will shift and it'll be found in other places. But we want to think ahead towards how this landscape will look once we pass through this particular time period.
Sure. But I know that there's a lot of folks who would say, well, maybe the way we get oil and gas now might change. But as we've seen even recently, we thought we couldn't get oil out of shale, and here we are.
Right.
We were able to do that. So the technology may allow us to find oil in places we didn't know it was there before. So it may not be as finite as we think.
Well, right. The shale resources have, certainly revolutionized what folks are doing in oil and gas work, for sure. But we're trying to envision the landscape in a different sense.
Still a longer term
right
look.
it's a longer term vision. And, how we get energy and use energy in 40 years, 50 years, it may be based on some oil and gas and coal, but odds are we're going to be doing other things by that point, because that's also the nature of the technological advancement.
Right. And so this is underway. And again, you have the support of the tribal entities, the Pueblos that have a direct connection to Chaco, it seems.
Right. We've worked real closely with a group called the All Pueblo Council of Governors. So this is the 19 New Mexico Pueblos plus the one that's in Texas, Isleta del Sur, which is actually folks originally from New Mexico. So I meet with that group several times a year. We update them on the work we're doing, and they raise concerns that they have. And they're really closely connected as well to working with BLM, with the Bureau of Indian Affairs. They've had a great deal of input on the Bureau of Reclamation's Navajo Gallup Water Supply Project.
Right.
And so I think at this point, the Pueblo people are really mapping on to the best ways to advocate for their ancestral sites. And really what we're doing with Archaeology Southwest is trying to help elevate and raise those voices for the people whose ancestors lived on the land, and
Sure.
be sure that we take that into account as we continue to develop and do what we're doing in the modern world.
Right. And I hate to sound like a broken record, but I do want to remind everyone that Chaco Canyon proper is always protected. That is not what we're talking about. It is this greater Chaco area, which is kind of this other kind of buffer zone around the park, and where there are other ruins and other discoveries and other things that are being encroached by some of the development, and if we're not careful, that's the concern.
Right, exactly. The Chaco Canyon is a national park. It's protected under our current laws, but we get outside Chaco and we're into a mix of lands. We have BLM managed lands, BIA lands, Navajo Nation lands, State of New Mexico lands, and some other private as well. So, we call it the checkerboard, and that's really what it looks like when you look on a map. So it's a complicated landscape to try to have input on, and I think the agencies are doing their best to manage this, but they require input from the public, from tribes, from other interested groups. So if folks have concerns about this, I really do encourage them to contact the local BLM. BLM is now telling us that they will have a draft of their long-range resource management plan completed at some point. It could be this month, it might be in November, but it's approaching a period of weeks when we'll see this. And this is something that our organization and our partners have worked on now for 5 years. So, we're very interested to see that document and to, provide input along the lines where we feel like we can have some positive impact.
Right. Very good. Well, Paul, we are out of time, I'm sorry to say, but always fascinating conversations with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Scott. Always great to be here.
Appreciate you coming over, and we will see you again in about a month.
We will.
All right. Very good. That's Paul Reed, my guest from Archaeology Southwest and Salmon Ruins here on KSJE. Back with more in just a moment. The time is 8:51.